Hello and welcome to Legal Basics with Sarah Law Global, and my name is Sian. Today we're going to discuss a form of employment that is catching fire in the globalized world, and this is outsourcing or contracting. Some countries call it contract labor. Now, in Africa and in some parts of Asia, historically, contract labor started during colonialism because there was a colonialist who probably owned a factory. They were not able to get workers to work for their factory, so they got somebody in between to be able to hire people, and then the people would work for them. So, as opposed to the classic kind of employment contract where you have either A, an employer, and B, an employee, in an outsourcing or a contract labor situation, you have A, an employee, you have a contractor in the middle, and then you have an employer. So classically, in that employment relationship, the employer will take care of all the issues concerning the workplace, concerning remuneration, concerning all the issues in the contract. And the employee will be in charge of delivering what they were hired for. However, in this situation, because there's three parties, some of the obligations of an employer now have to be divided between an employer and a contractor. Now, with us today is a lady who is an expert on these matters. She comes highly recommended, and I will let her introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Sian. My name is Lorraine Oyombe, and I'm a legal practitioner in Kenya. I've been an advocate for the last 7 years.
Mm-hmm. So, Lorraine, please explain to us what is outsourcing or contracting?
Okay, so I think you really introduced it well enough. Mm-hmm. And in a nutshell, outsourcing, the way you've explained, is where a contracting entity hires or procures another entity to give its services, and that entity delivers those services using its own employees. So you'll see there's the contracting out company, mm-hmm. and then the company which is providing employees, I would call it the service provider, mm-hmm. and then its own employees, I would call them the outsourced employees. Okay. So that is what outsourcing basically is. And we can see so many examples within us every day in Kenya. For example, most security services are nowadays outsourced because you'll find most buildings don't actually hire the security in their building, but they've contracted it out to another entity as a service, and then that entity uses its own employees to provide that service.
Okay. So now, in our season 1, we dealt with issues around work injury, mm-hmm. where the employer was under the obligation of providing a safe work environment. Mm-hmm. We dealt with issues of even termination, even mm-hmm. notice as the employment relationship goes and when it has to come to an end. Now, in this situation, let's say if I'm the employee, mm-hmm. that means I am employed by one party, mm-hmm. yet I work at the workplace of another party, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. So what are the obligations of the employer and the contractor within this arrangement?
Okay. So I'll start with the obligations of the contracting out party. That this is the party who is seeking those services, mm-hmm. of an outsourcing agent. Okay. So there are obligations, I would say, to the employees of the service provider, mm-hmm. To ensure that there's a safe work environment. Because as much as these people are not their direct employees, mm-hmm. they are still liable for the safety of the place where these people are executing that work. Mm-hmm. And this is anchored on the Occupational Safety and Health Act, okay. which provides that if you are, I would say, the master of a workplace or someone in control of a workplace, even if you don't own it, mm-hmm. then you're the one responsible to ensure the safety and welfare of all people who work there. So okay. mm-hmm. that is their obligation. Mm-hmm. And then secondly, in terms of the Employment Act and also the Constitution, some elements of discrimination also come in mm-hmm. the sense that sometimes the contracting out party has their own employees mm-hmm. who are working directly for them mm-hmm. alongside the employees of the service provider.
Okay.
And a situation may arise where people are doing the same work, mm-hmm. but they're not being paid the same rates.
Just like security, as you said.
Yes.
I could have my own security guard.
Yes.
and then another one that comes from the company that
Yes.
we've outsourced from.
Yes. Yes. So if there's a scenario where discrimination is prevailing, and it's a scenario where you are not even taking any steps to make sure there's equality, then that is also an obligation for you to ensure that this person who is giving you a service is not giving you a service that's perpetuating discrimination. So you, in your commercial contract with them, it's something you need to take care of and make sure that they are paying their person a wage that is not discriminative compared to what you're paying. So those are very key nuances that the courts normally examine when you're looking at an outsourcing arrangement to ensure that that doesn't come up, aspects of discrimination.
Actually, I'm happy that you bring this up. So now there's a contract between an employer and a contractor. Then there's a contract between the contractor and the people they've hired.
Yes.
Two separate contracts, right?
Yes.
It's not usually one tripartite.
No.
So now me as the employer,
Yes.
I have this service that I need done. I need food for 100 guests. Then I get this company that tells me I have caterers. So for me, I don't negotiate with the company what they will pay their people, usually.
Yes.
So I tell them, all right, so I need 100 guests and I need, how much are you giving me? So in this first contract, I negotiate with a contractor. Now, as this employer, as you say, in the case that now there might be discrimination, am I supposed to examine the contracts that this contractor gets into with now the employee?
It's something that needs to come up in your commercial agreement with this person so that the effect of your agreement is not something that is breaching the law.
Okay.
Because you see, you can directly breach or indirectly do it. So you're not really supposed to examine, because, okay, it's good to do that, but if you have it as a clause in your agreement that they warrant that they're doing they're upholding labor laws. For example, sometimes you'll even find people who are even underpaying the people who are coming to work for you. So those are things that you as a contracting out party need to be alive to, so that you're not a part of that illegality, I would say.
Okay.
So it's something you should check and something you should have in your contract for it to be a proper outsourcing.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, when I was a student and when I went to my first judicial attachment, and I would see all these work injury cases in court, I used to realize that every time somebody got injured and they sued the company would then come to court and say, but you're not my employee.
Yes.
And they would say, we've contracted another company to get us workers. Now, in the event that there's work injury, who is liable? Is it the contractor or is it the employer?
Okay, for work injury, I would say it's a bit unique because, like all civil matters, you can always institute a third-party proceeding.
Sure.
So, for work injury, it would be the outsourcing service provider, because they are the direct employer of this employee.
Okay.
So if I am an outsourcing service provider and I'm providing another company a service, and let's say that company needs cleaners who need to climb up and clean
the windows on 70th floor.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I am the one who is to ensure that the person I'm providing, or the person I'm giving out to do that, has the right equipment, because they are my employee. And I'm the one directing them, go to this place and clean the windows. So in terms of if they get the injury because they were not well equipped or they were not given enough training, then the outsourcing service provider would be liable for that.
Okay.
But if the injury is because they got there and the roof collapsed, it brings in the first scenario where I said the first company would be liable as the occupier of that place,
because they own the building.
Yes.
They should have had it safe.
Yes.
Okay. So now, outsourcing, when it started, it used to be things that are within one jurisdiction. But as globalization has invaded all our lives, now there's internet, there's money services. Now you actually call some companies in the US and somebody with an Indian accent picks your call.
Yes.
So that means now people are starting to leverage on the more favorable labor terms across their borders. So if a person is looking to outsource for a company in Kenya, what laws do they need to be aware of?
So, for example, you mean if someone wants to get workers from Kenya?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So if they need to get workers from Kenya, I would say there's no direct law governing outsourcing relationships. So you'll find there's no direct, let's say, labor law governing even agencies which provide their outsourced staff.
Sure.
So that would be a commercial kind of contract, but they still need to be aware of the occupational laws that I said, the occupational safety. They need to be aware of the aspects of discrimination. So, and also the constitution, which applies to everybody. So you can't hire Kenyan workers in a scenario which violates our own constitution. So that is something they still have to be alive to.
All right.
But unfortunately, we are not in a position where we have a law governing that relationship explicitly.
Okay, so this platform also examines the spaces of legislative reform, like where we don't have laws yet, and we need probably to work on them.
Yes.
If you were to just at the top of your head, just think what really needs regulation. If there was to be a law, what needs to be put in place?
At the top of my mind, I think enough protections need to be put in place to ensure that the result of this commercial agreement does not violate minimum wage guidelines, and also provides dignity in the sense of the kind of contracts that people get into, the outsourced employees, because you'll find sometimes you can be put in a long-term contract, yet your company, the one that's outsourcing you out, only has a 2-year contract. And when the 2 years end, you have nowhere to go.
Exactly.
And no one told you that this was only a 2-year arrangement. You've been hired, maybe you think you're a permanent and pensionable person.
And the contractor has a limited.
So there's a lot of disruption. So maybe the kind of contracts that can be entered into in such arrangements would need to be looked at by the law to give people certainty. And to give people, I would say, just that dignity of knowing that fine, I'm an outsourced employee and I'll probably be employed for 2 years, 3 years, and in this day and age it's acceptable. I think gone are the days when people expect to work somewhere for 50 years. So top of my mind, that is what I would say is important.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because I think the contract, even with the contractor, needs to be examined. You see, we live in the age of tenderpreneurs, where a person that has never seen the gate of an engineering school gets $1 billion worth contract for an engineering job. And what are the chances that this person has even the know-how to get into a contract that is going to protect the engineers that he's going to hire? So it's very important for there to be a law that even conditions this contractor. By the time you come and say that you want to supply medical equipment, what do you know about a theater? But now, just to wrap up, when a person has been outsourced, I work for the contractor who then works for the employer. What choice do I have in the employer that I work for? For example, in the classic employment relationship, an employer chooses and an employee chooses. An employee is able to say, well, that workplace does not align with my values, or that employer does not treat me as well as I would like to, or that workplace is not good for me. However, in this two-stage employment, I work for the contractor. How does an employee? Can an employee just be moved from one employer to another? Do they get to decide, much as you've outsourced my services, I can only go this way and not that way?
Unfortunately, the truth of the matter is the first scenario you described, because the balance of power is normally on the employer. So if the employer decides they'll assign you to this company, then you don't really have much of a liberty to say, I don't want to go there. And if you do that, the effect of that is probably saying, I don't want to work anymore. Which means then you don't really have a choice. So until that balance is met, it's going to be an unequal situation where the employee can't really choose. And then secondly, also, that choice may not even be there for the outsourcing service provider, because that may be the only business they have at the moment.
Okay.
They wouldn't, maybe they don't have anywhere else to take you.
Yeah, that place that aligns with your values,
yes,
we don't have it.
they don't have it.
Okay, then maybe just to wrap up, where does an employer and a contractor, what does a contractor need to know?
Okay. So by contractor now you mean the person
in the middle,
yes,
the one that outsources.
Okay.
Yeah.
The one who has the employees.
Yes, the one with the employees.
I think for them, they need to know that the full obligations of an employer are on them.
Okay.
So when they're negotiating their commercial contract with a contracting agency, they need to consider these costs they'll incur and have them as part of that contract to ensure that they are not shortchanging their own employees.
Okay.
So they'll be responsible for the medical, responsible for NSF, NHIF, you know, all those aspects of termination of employment, following procedures, appraisals, such things. So that costs, or those administrative functions, they're squarely on them, and they're costly, and they need to consider that when they're negotiating the business with the contracting out agency.
Great. You need to know that if you're going to get people for another employer, you take over almost all the obligations of the employer, and it is you who will be held liable.
Yes.
So any emerging issues from the courts?
From the courts, yes, we have a case actually. It's in this book for Kashindi's Digest of Employment Cases. And in this case, it's a case involving transfer of employees from one entity to another. And it's a case of Airtel. I think they were sued by a number of employees, about 60 employees. And what happened is they were working for their employer, and then their employer wanted to outsource that service.
Okay.
But instead of getting the service provider to bring in their own employees, they took their employees who were already working there
and gave them to the
contractor. And what happened in this scenario is the court held that firstly, this contractor now fully stepped into the shoes of Airtel as their employer, and all the previous rights and obligations that Airtel had in respect of these employees were taken over by this new employer. And then secondly, that in such a scenario, it was unlawful to transfer the employees without their consent.
Yeah, for sure, because you have a contract with the first person.
Yes.
How do you now work for another one?
Yes, without telling me, because my contract was just with you. You can't now transfer it without my consent.
And say you come to work here anyway.
Yes.
Yeah.
And now the main issue of contention was that, of course, there are differences in terms of benefits between the two employers. So the employees ended up being shortchanged. And that's why the court was saying that they didn't consent to that in the first place. And secondly, now that you took it over, you have to give them all the full benefits they were entitled to as their previous employer.
Were they compensated?
Yes, they were.
They were compensated.
Yeah.
Wow, we've come to the end of our broadcast. Thank you so much. I feel like I've also learned a little bit. You should be a lecturer.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Viewers, I hope you enjoyed, but I really hope you also learned a lot, especially in this world where things are changing. Outsourcing is one of the ways that people can set up new entities and give services to the rest of the world. So you need to know that if you're an outsourced agency, then you need to know all the obligations of an employer. So if the viewers have any questions regarding today's broadcast, how can they reach you?
They can reach me through you.
Okay.
And then you can let me know. Yes.
All right. So me, who is now Lorraine's official secretary.
An agent.
I've been outsourced
to
collect your questions. You can reach me through info@cyroglobal.com. That's info@cyroglobal.com. You can also reach us through our old Gmail address. That is cyrologglobal@gmail.com. And before we close our broadcast, we would like to say thanks to Mushiri Frames, who is our videography crew. They will display their contacts on the screen, and they can also do videos like this for you. And we'd also like to say thanks to J.O. Ojuma Advocates for facilitating the shooting of this series. Take care of yourselves, venture, form outsourcing firms, know your law. Bye-bye.
Bye.